Hello, everyone. Welcome to our 1093rd meeting, number 7 of the 43rd season. And it's a privilege to welcome to Keele World Affairs tonight the Honourable Ralph Goodale, High Commissioner for Canada in the UK. And as you will have studied his biography over the last 6 months while it's been on our website, what you will see is that he has a huge wealth of political experience at the top of both provincial and federal Canadian systems of government, which he may or not choose to highlight, it being a very complicated area in its own right. But as you will have seen, he's been a minister in so many areas: natural resources, public works, finance, and most recently, Minister of Public Safety. So he knows a lot about the nitty-gritty of running a country. And I read somewhere a bit of a hint that he might even have been close to becoming Canada's Prime Minister on more than one occasion during his long service. But we've got plenty of recent experience here of Prime Ministers in this country. So it may be that not being Prime Minister is an indicator of a deeper wisdom. So in our 1,000 meetings, we've talked about geopolitics a great deal, and the United States of America has frequently dominated our conversations, rather to the exclusion of other democratic voices. So tonight's a welcome opportunity to put that right. The Honourable Ralph Goodale was appointed the High Commissioner, I think it's back in April 2021, so he's probably up to speed with what's going on in the UK. I've no doubt that he will be interested in the questions you put in the Q&A, and he's got all the rights of protocol to choose not to answer some of them, but don't let that stop you from bowling some curved balls in his direction, as you so often do to our guest speakers. Let's find out where Canada stands on the big issues of the world. And so please welcome the Honourable Ralph Goodale.
Thank you. Well, Bill, thank you very, very much for a wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. Merci pour votre invitation et salutations du Canada. Thank you for inviting me to Keele this evening to talk a bit about my duties as Canada's High Commissioner in the United Kingdom, the shape of Canada-UK relations, and our work together on so many fronts for peace, security, and economic success in a deeply troubled world. I am very glad to have this opportunity, and I do understand that we have our mutual friend, Margaret Milland, to thank for being the matchmaker for this occasion. First, some quick background to set the scene. Canada's diplomatic mission in the United Kingdom is our oldest foreign posting, with roots that date back to 1869, which was only 2 years after the British North America Act at Westminster established Canadian Confederation in the first place. At the Canadian High Commission, we have close to 300 employees, making the UK Canada's second largest mission abroad after Washington. Perched conspicuously on Trafalgar Square in central London, since 1925, Canada House is the most visible embassy of them all in the UK. Geographically, Canada is 45 times bigger than the United Kingdom. But demographically, we have just over half of your population. You could fit all of the United Kingdom within the four corners of my home province of Saskatchewan. In that space, Saskatchewan has just over 1 million people. The UK, in that space, has close to 70 million people. So size and density are a couple of big distinctions between our two countries. We are both wealthy G7 nations. Britain is the 6th largest economy in the world. Gross domestic product has reached $3.1 trillion US. Canada's GDP is $2.1 trillion US, making us the world's 9th largest economy. On an individual basis, Canada's GDP per capita is just above $58,000 per person. In the UK, GDP per capita is just below $55,000 per person. So it's pretty close, but Canada has the edge. In the realm of multilateralism, through the Commonwealth, the UN, and all of its related organizations, like the International Maritime Organization, for example, which is based in London, through NATO, the Five Eyes, the G7, the G20, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and on it goes, Canada and the UK are members together in more international organizations than any two countries on earth. It's been my great privilege to be the Canadian High Commissioner in Great Britain and Northern Ireland for 2.5 years now, since April of 2021, and it's a terrific assignment for at least 4 compelling reasons. First, because London and the UK are simply wonderful places to be, with history and culture and something fascinating or completely outrageous on every street corner. Secondly, despite Brexit, the UK is a major global intersection for international politics, economics, diplomacy, and intrigue on many different levels. The whole world passes through here all of the time. So the posting in London is strategically important. Third, the extensive relationship between Canada and the United Kingdom, the product, quite literally, of hundreds of years of shared history and heritage, is deep and rich and vibrant and highly functional. It works. It includes, of course, the same monarch, similar governmental, legal, and commercial systems, more than $410 billion in two-way investment and trade, common military and security traditions, alliances, and current operations, robust cultural, academic, and scientific ties, too many family connections to even begin to count, and above all, a deep reservoir of genuine respect and trust, grounded in our lived experience with one another, and in the values that we have promoted and defended together in the world for a very long time, and for which we both have always been prepared to sacrifice, to safeguard our way of life. Fourthly, this is a terrific assignment because it's extremely busy. There is no risk of being bored. Former Prime Minister Harold Macmillan is alleged to have said, no one can actually find the quote, but he is alleged to have said once upon a time that government plans and operations are largely shaped and could be radically altered very quickly by events, my dear boy, events. And certainly that would be true of what I've witnessed in this job over the past 30 fast-paced and event-filled months. And to summarize, let's take a quick walk down that memory lane. When I first arrived in the spring of 2021, the main event was Boris Johnson, an election-winning machine, 20 points ahead in all the polls. The UK was wrestling with the difficulties of implementing Brexit, like that vexing Irish border problem. And Boris, the happy populist, with a personality as big as all outdoors, assured everyone that everything was going to be okay. At the same time, the UK was beginning to reopen after all the restrictions that had been imposed because of COVID. As the pandemic subsided, Britain hosted the first post-COVID summit of all the G7 leaders. That was in June of 2021 in Cornwall. And for the record, the hot topics back then were vaccine distributions, economic recovery after COVID, and China. That was followed later that summer by the chaotic evacuation from Afghanistan, triggering a surge of refugees. More than 30,000 Afghans headed to Canada, for whom the processing was largely done through our London Immigration Centre at Canada House. The next big event was AUKUS, a deal for transferring technology for nuclear-powered submarines from the US and the UK to Australia. The way that was rolled out caused some friction in our Five Eyes relationships. Upon direction from our two prime ministers, or rather our one prime minister and your three prime ministers, we have since been hard at work on even stronger and deeper security and intelligence partnerships between Canada and the UK. Up next was COP26 in Glasgow, and some ambitious plans to strengthen the fight against climate change, which were pared back a bit a year later at COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and again this past summer when the UK government made some policy adjustments to reduce the cost of climate action on stressed-out consumers, who of course will be stressed-out voters in just a few months. But similar moves and actions with respect to climate plans have been announced in a number of other countries around the world, including in Canada. But let me get back to my chronological order. Shortly after COP26 in Glasgow, the year 2022 dawned with growing anxiety about Putin's plans for Ukraine. We in the Five Eyes were convinced that a violent attack was imminent, and it happened on February the 24th. Putin relaunched a full-scale, brutal, and totally illegal war of imperial aggression against Ukraine. Ever since then, Canada, the UK, and most of the free world have been responding to this existential threat, not just a threat to Ukraine, but to the sovereignty of all nations, to the integrity of international institutions, to the sanctity of human rights and freedoms everywhere, threats to the viability of the rule of law and a rules-based system for decent international behavior. All of this is now at stake because of Putin. By the spring of 2022, two major trade events were getting underway between Canada and the UK. One was the United Kingdom's application to join the 11 countries, including Canada, who were already in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the so-called CPTPP. The other was the negotiation of a bilateral Canada-UK free trade agreement to deal with issues created by Brexit. When Britain exited from the EU, the country also exited from the EU's rather well-functioning trade deal with Canada. A quick trade continuity agreement was put in place to fill the immediate gap, but what's needed for the long term is a full-fledged free trade agreement, bilateral deal negotiated between Canada and the UK, and that is what we are working at right now. In June of 2022, along came a truly happy and glorious event in the celebration of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee. The outpouring of affection and respect was far and wide and totally genuine. Millions took part, both here and around the world, before the Queen headed to Scotland for what would prove to be her last summer at Balmoral. Back in London, a bit of a political circus was beginning to be the dominant event. From being 20 points ahead a year earlier, Mr. Johnson was now polling 12 points behind. Scandals of various kinds had compounded, issues were piling up, ministers and senior officials were resigning in large numbers, and then on the 7th of July, Mr. Johnson announced that he would be resigning too. That triggered a turbulent but fascinating leadership process within the Conservative Party. It originally involved 11 or more would-be contenders who were quickly winnowed down to the remaining 2, and Rishi Sunak faced off against Liz Truss, and Ms. Truss won in a vote among the party rank and file. She visited the Queen. They shook hands on the 6th of September as she became officially Prime Minister, and she was in the midst of finishing her cabinet selections when Her Majesty passed away on that Thursday afternoon, September the 8th. The immediate accession of His Majesty King Charles III, the cortege from Balmoral, the 11 days of official mourning, the lying in state, the state funeral, the pilgrimages to London by most of the leaders of the entire world. All of that demonstrated the peerless British talent for pomp and ceremony at its very best. And what Canadian could forget the RCMP, the Mounties, from the musical ride, leading that solemn procession away from Westminster Abbey? Those few days were spectacular. They also constituted the largest and most complex logistical and security operation in the United Kingdom since World War II. Shortly after the dignitaries departed, the new government under Prime Minister Truss began to work on what would prove to be a less populist but more sharply ideological approach to the economy. Financial markets reacted in a rattled sort of way. The Bank of England was alarmed, and public confidence was eroded. In fact, at one point in those days, Labour surged to a lead of nearly 40 points in some of the public opinion polls. The always restive government caucus was again in revolt, and Ms. Truss's situation quickly became untenable. After 49 chaotic days, the shortest tenure of any British Prime Minister, she gave way to Rishi Sunak, who was then the third person to hold that office in fewer than 4 months. Foreign diplomats sometimes get asked by the media whether all this turmoil signaled systemic weaknesses somehow in the British system of democracy. I, for one, think not. It was a political crisis in one political party. There were rules to follow, and the rules were followed under the normal procedures. Never once was the Constitution or legality called into question. The worst thing that got threatened was an election. Imagine that in a democracy, that it might be settled by an election. Compare what happened in British politics in the summer of 2022 to what had happened in American politics in January of 2021, where a head of government and a head of state tried to upset an election and applauded what appeared to be an insurrection on Capitol Hill. By comparison, the Brits look pretty good. Mr. Sunak has proven to be far more conventional than his predecessors. His more mainstream economic prescriptions, building on the initial steps taken by Chancellor Hunt, restored some sense of calm and reason in the markets. By Christmas, the polling margin between the Conservatives and Labour had narrowed to a gap of 15 to 20 points, and that's pretty well where the polls have remained right up until today. There will be, as you all know, a British general election within the next year or so. For Mr. Sunak, the question is whether his response to all of the events that have gone before him will actually pay dividends that voters can feel before the end of next summer, in time to re-elect his government. For Keir Starmer and Labour, the challenge is maintaining their momentum as a government in waiting without draining their credibility or weakening their internal cohesion. And they say in politics, 6 months can be a lifetime. It will be fascinating to watch as all of this political theater plays out, including the Prime Minister's choice about timing that election in relation to the other big political event that will be happening in 2024, and that, of course, is the presidential election in the United States. So far in 2023, there have been two major celebratory events for both Canada and the United Kingdom, which merit, I think, special mention in this chronology. At Easter time, we all came together in Northern Ireland to mark the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, which finally ended the infamous Troubles in Northern Ireland back in 1998. Two distinguished Canadians, the late Mr. Justice Peter Corey and retired General John de Chastelain, played indispensable roles in achieving the conditions that made that peace possible. There were a great many people that contributed to that effort, and Canada is very proud that the effort included two very proactive Canadians. The anniversary gave us an opportunity to see them suitably acknowledged. It was also an opportunity for the Sunak government to highlight its recent Windsor framework, which the Prime Minister successfully negotiated with the EU to help resolve the border issues between Northern Ireland and the South. The other major celebration was, of course, His Majesty's coronation in early May. Again, it was a brilliant show of uniquely British pageantry. Canadians took part both here and in Canada. Both our Prime Minister and our Governor-General were here. The Prime Minister was on his fourth official visit to the UK during my tenure as High Commissioner, and the Governor-General was on her third such visit. Perhaps most significant, 2 days before the coronation, King Charles sat down for an extensive personal conversation with all of the elected leadership of Canada's Indigenous peoples. Absolutely without precedent, that royal encounter at Buckingham Palace with the great-great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, in whose name most Indigenous treaties in Canada were made. That encounter opened a dialogue that may have a profound impact on the process of healing and reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. 2023 has also been a year of vigorous economic engagement between Canada and the United Kingdom. There have been high-caliber missions and exchanges both ways on defense and security equipment, AI, quantum, cybersecurity, biomanufacturing, high-tech exports led by women, plant protein and food ingredients, agricultural technology, clean tech, and the world's safest supply chains for critical minerals. This is all part of our existing economic relationship, in which the UK is Canada's third largest trading partner after the US and China. The UK is also our second largest source and our second largest destination of foreign direct investment to and from Canada. As I mentioned, the cumulative value of our two-way commercial activity is more than $410 billion, and it's rising. The two trade deals that we have been working on these last many months are aimed at making it all grow even more. The Canada-UK bilateral free trade talks have completed 7 rounds of negotiating. Another is set just before Christmas. Solid progress has been made toward a comprehensive and ambitious free trade deal to be finished by next summer. Of course, as in any bargaining process, the hardest issues tend to get pushed toward the end of the process, so we are now beginning to encounter some of the toughest parts of the bargaining, and we'll see how that evolves in the next several months. Meanwhile, discussions about the UK's application to join the plurilateral CPTPP, that's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, have been completed. The British signed on to this pact this past July, specifically committing themselves to all of the CPTPP's entrance requirements. And Canada will be following one angle of this in particular. The rules of the Trans-Pacific Partnership say clearly and unequivocally that if you have a border measure in place in your country that has the effect of restricting trade, then that measure, in order to be sustained, must be science-based. It must have a sound, factual basis in science. You cannot simply ban a product arbitrarily. You must have a legitimate scientific justification. The UK has now officially, by joining the CPTPP, agreed to that rule. But it still wants to ban certain Canadian products, like beef, for example, from entering the UK market. Thousands of tons of British beef are sold into Canada every year, but hardly a morsel of Canadian beef gets into the UK. And that is clearly an imbalance. It is protectionism, a non-tariff trade barrier with no scientific justification. Canadian beef producers, I have to tell you, feel very strongly about this issue. They believe the ban is not legitimate, that it's not sustainable, and if it cannot be negotiated, it will end up in a dispute settlement litigation. And by the way, that's not the end of the world. That is not a detraction from our relationship. It is a demonstration of a mature, respectful, sophisticated relationship between two equal trading partners. We also need to show those same qualities, maturity, respect, and sophistication, in restraining some of our respective trade protagonists from maligning our respective food safety and health of animals systems. And sometimes those passions get a little bit out of control. Invariably, when the issue of Canadian beef comes up, there are those in the UK who say that Canada is trying to diminish British food standards. Well, that is untrue. Canada has an excellent food quality and safety system. It compares favorably to the best on earth. It's every bit as good as the systems here in the UK or in the EU. Our satisfied customers, Canada markets food products all around the world. Our satisfied customers include the most discriminating and demanding food consumers in the world. Indeed, our only major health of animals issue in recent memory in Canada dates back now about 30 years to when a case of BSE, the so-called mad cow disease, was imported into Canada. And ironically, that came from the UK. That food crisis in Canada around BSE cost our Canadian producers billions of dollars. Trade bans that resulted from 30 years ago have just recently started to come off. So you can be assured that we are totally attuned to quality and safety issues and top-of-the-line animal husbandry. Let me close with some reflections on three current global situations in which the United Kingdom and Canada are very closely aligned. First, with respect to relations with India. Both Canada and the UK aspire to have free trade agreements with India. We both acknowledge and welcome India's strategic positioning as a very important democracy with the largest population in the world and the fifth largest economy in the world, in a critically important region of the world. But there is a problem. As Prime Minister Trudeau revealed first privately at the highest levels in India and later publicly in our House of Commons, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a link between agents of the Government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen in British Columbia this past June. Like the UK, Canada is a rule of law country. The protection of our citizens and the defense of our sovereignty are fundamental. Any involvement of any foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of international law and contrary to the fundamental rules by which free, open, and democratic societies conduct themselves. We asked for India's cooperation. The initial response was escalating retaliation, including the effective expulsion of 41 Canadian diplomats from their work in India by stripping away their diplomatic status. That, too, is a blatant violation of international law, and in particular, the Vienna Convention. We appreciate very much the support, the advice, and the collaboration of our friends and allies in this very unhappy situation. The United Kingdom has issued at least 2 very supportive public statements. This is a country where Litvinenko was murdered extrajudicially. This is the country where the Skripal family was attacked extrajudicially. The UK understands very well what is at stake here, and Canada is enormously grateful for the principled British solidarity in these circumstances, along with the staunch support that we've had from the United States and Australia and New Zealand and others. There are some recent indications of a moderating response on India's part. We, of course, welcome that, and we hope that matters evolve toward effective solutions. Secondly, Ukraine. Putin's war is now well beyond 600 days. Isolated and delusional, Putin thought he would be welcomed in Ukraine as a liberator. He thought he would conquer all the resistance within just a week or so. He thought the free world would easily wilt and divide, and he was wrong on every count. The coalition of freedom-loving people around the world who support the defense of Ukraine's sovereignty and their sovereign right not to be attacked and to live in peace has been remarkably cohesive, coherent, and durable. And in the early days of rallying that international support, the leadership provided by Great Britain was enormously important. You remember that early trip that Prime Minister Johnson made to Kyiv to absolutely cement the West's cohesive support for Ukraine in those dire circumstances. That Putin was surprised at the strength of character in the Ukrainian people is a measure of his ignorance of who they are. Canadians know who they are. Ukrainians have been emigrating to Canada for more than 130 years. They are nation builders. Today, more than 1.4 million Canadians, that's close to 4% of our national population, trace their family heritage to Ukraine. We have the second largest Ukrainian diaspora in the world. We stand in awe, but we are not surprised at the strength and skill, the determination, the resilience, the tenacity, the courage, and the valor of the Ukrainian people. Their thirst for freedom is unquenchable. Their quest for independence and self-determination is legendary. Their culture, their heritage, their identity are distinctive and very real. So yes, Ukrainians will fight for all of that for as long as it takes. And as they do, they form the global front line for democracy worldwide. And the free world must stand with them for as long as it takes. The United Kingdom and Canada have been standing with Ukraine from the very beginning. In fact, for several years before the very beginning, before Putin's war, we were actively training Ukrainian defense forces at bases in Ukraine. After the illegal invasion, we relocated to training bases in the UK, and more recently in Poland and Latvia. This is practical, high-impact support that makes a big difference on the ground. Ukrainian forces have been impressive on the battlefield, and professional training by Canadians and by the British and others is part of the reason why. Like the UK, Canada is also providing military equipment and supplies, transport logistics, intelligence, economic support, humanitarian aid, and technical assistance to Ukraine. We're also enlarging our commitment in Latvia and helping to shore up NATO's eastern flank. So far, the Canadian investment in support of Ukraine adds up to nearly $9 billion. We've also received more than 1.2 million applications for temporary entry into Canada for potential Ukrainian refugees. Again, many of them processed through Canada House in London. Close to 1 million of those applications have now been approved. A Canadian company, one of the largest uranium producers in the world, called Cameco, has displaced Russia as Ukraine's source of fuel for nuclear power. And we are coordinating very closely with the UK and with other allies on extensive sanctions and other more creative penalties to render Putin as much of a global outcast as possible. And together, we will now have a further challenge, maintaining focus and a proper sense of priority on the war in Ukraine. After his initial empty bravado, Putin has pivoted. He is now counting on a long, painful ordeal, counting on Ukraine's friends growing weary, bickering, running into high costs, political dissent, and taxpayer resistance, becoming distracted and dropping away. We need to work very hard to ensure that none of that happens. In voting at the UN, typically more than 140 countries vote consistently to support Ukraine and to condemn Putin's vile behavior. Only a tiny handful of the most disreputable regimes actually support Russia. But more than 40 typically abstain or fail to show up, including a dozen from the Commonwealth. That illustrates the extent of Putin's insidious influence, together with frustrations about a global system that many smaller and less wealthy countries see as biased and unfair toward them. The magnitude of the diplomatic job that must be done, especially across that gap between Western nations and those in the so-called global South, bridging that gap is a huge diplomatic challenge, and it's exceedingly important. Finally, and most recently, of course, there is the barbaric terrorist attack by Hamas on innocent people across southern Israel, an extensive and complex operation meticulously planned for months and months, executed with ghastly brutality, atrocities left and right, calculated to provoke the maximum rage and the maximum destabilization in the region. putting both Israelis and Palestinians in mortal danger. Canada has unequivocally condemned Hamas. It is a terrorist organization under Canadian law. Hamas does not represent the Palestinian people. Nothing can justify its grotesque behavior. Canada supports Israel's right to defend itself under the UN Charter and in accordance with international and humanitarian law. Even in times of war, there are rules that must be upheld. Civilians must not be targeted or used as human shields. Hostages must be released without harm, and life-saving aid must get through to those in need. We are deeply worried about the desperate humanitarian situation in Gaza and the horrendous risk of a larger conflagration in the region. Canada has increased recently its humanitarian aid for vulnerable Palestinians. Our Prime Minister and his ministers are constantly active with allies and counterparts in the search for a way forward. Ultimately, we continue to believe in a two-state solution, but we recognize the massive diplomatic and humanitarian mountains that must be climbed before the world can get there. And with that in mind, let me close by harking back to one fundamental point: the size and quality of the historic relationship between Canada and the UK. It's a very good relationship. It's tight. But we should never take it for granted, because it's probably more important now than it has ever been. First, because of the dangerous, uncertain times in which we live. Autocratic and violent regimes are in the ascendancy around the world. Democracy is more of a minority and at greater risk in the world today than ever before in our lifetimes. Democracy's credibility has been undermined by a corrosive combination of deceitful diplomacy, disinformation, economic coercion, big dollars, and the debt that follows those dollars, all poured in by China and Russia and some others, inflating their influence and diminishing ours. And secondly, the leading bulwark for democracy in the world, namely the United States, has been sadly riven by populism, extremism, polarization, and foreign interference, such that America may potentially be less willing in future or less able to play the familiar, reliable role in global affairs that we've come to know and depend upon for the past 80 years. So what happens then? In this difficult and dangerous world, the expectations on Canada and the UK will be enormous. They're already large, and they will grow. We dare not fall short. Our shared values and our deep connections with each other, that reservoir of respect and trust, and that capacity to work together will be more vital than ever as we look at each other as family, allies, partners, and friends. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
I'm going to start off, well, where shall we start? We'll start with Indigenous peoples, because you refer to that. John Sherwood. So what's Canada doing to restore the heritage and lands of the Indigenous people and give them equal rights in Canada? Hopefully, he says, unlike Australia and the United States. And Don Muir and Richard Melton put it a different way. Please, could you describe the situation of Indigenous inhabitants of Canada, because we probably don't have much idea here, and compare that with other Commonwealth countries?
Well, those are big questions. This is probably the greatest socioeconomic challenge that Canada has to face. The relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, the recognition of long-standing grievances that Indigenous people have had, the recompense that goes into addressing those grievances, and then the challenge of building the future for the next generations to come. This process really began to gain credibility and gravitas in Canada with a Royal Commission that was struck a number of years ago that provided an elaborate report on the status of Indigenous people in Canada. And various governments over the last 20 or 30 years have tried to come to grips with this, because you've got the legacy of a very long and hurtful discrimination that went on and on and on and on for a very long time. Probably the two most obvious manifestations of that are the Indian residential schools, as they were called, where children were forcibly taken from their families and sent to residential schools that were run largely by the churches and various religious orders. And if you go back into the ancient records of the Government of Canada back into the 1800s, the descriptions of the purpose of those schools is absolutely horrendous. It's a legacy that Canada and Canadians cannot at all be proud of. The last of those schools went out of existence only, I think, in about 1990, thereabouts. The very last one was closed. But the government since, starting in many ways with Mr. Mulroney, followed by Mr. Chrétien, followed in particular by Prime Minister Paul Martin, and then most recently, then Mr. Harper, and then most recently, Justin Trudeau. They have tried very hard to begin to turn this legacy around. But it is so deeply rooted in generation after generation after generation of Indigenous people that correcting that, making amends for it, and then turning the corner to a more happy and productive future is a very difficult challenge. I think historians looking at this suite of events would say that two prime ministers in particular have made this an absolute priority for themselves while they were in office. One is the Right Honourable Paul Martin, who was Prime Minister only for a short time, but during that time negotiated something that was called the Kelowna Accord, which for the first time began the process in a large and comprehensive way of apologizing, making amends, and investing in the well-being of Indigenous people. The real telling point with Mr. Martin is that while he was Prime Minister from about 1993 until, pardon me, he was in the government starting in 1993. He was Prime Minister from 2003 until 2006. After he stopped being Prime Minister, when he no longer had any legal responsibility for this, he created his own foundation with his own money and money that he raised from other people across the country to invest in Indigenous education, to make sure that Indigenous people in Canada had the same educational opportunities as other Canadians. And to this day, he continues to make those investments. So he really, I think in the most tangible of ways, worked to turn this around. And then the current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, said on the very day his government was first elected in 2015 that the single most important relationship during the lifetime of his government would be the relationship that he had with Indigenous people. And in the field of clean water and housing and economic development and education and healthcare, he has led a commitment that is investing billions of dollars in trying to correct those grievances that have festered for so very long. But another person, I think, who is going to play a significant role is His Majesty King Charles III. He took the initiative with Canada's Governor General to arrange that meeting 2 days before the coronation. All of the elected leaders of Canada's Indigenous organizations were there. The Governor General was there, and that's significant because she is an Inuit woman from northern Quebec. She's an Indigenous person herself, the Right Honourable Mary Simon. And the Indigenous leaders, His Majesty, and the Governor General were due to meet for about 20, 25 minutes. The meeting went on for an hour and a half, and it started a process of communication and healing and reconciliation that may profoundly change the course of history on these issues for the future. And it's a real credit to His Majesty that he takes this issue as one that is exceedingly important to him personally, and he wants to make a difference.
Can we move on to another slightly Indigenous issue? This is from Joe Sexton. It sort of comes in two parts. Joe, my biggest ever culture shock was crossing the provincial border from Ontario to Quebec. Is the French-English, and she's talking about 1980, is the French-English language issue still as divisive as it was back then when it was stirred up by Charles de Gaulle? And coupled to that is there's a query here as to whether, in some queer way, the relationship with the EU might have changed, especially the French, since Brexit. Would you like to sort of comment, take those two things together?
I'm not sure about the last part of that. Canada is a big, diverse, rambunctious, complex place. It's where the diversity of the whole world comes together. And if you were to imagine a set of circumstances that would make a country difficult to imagine or unlikely to exist, you'd probably write down a list of things that pretty closely resembled Canada. We've got this vast geographic landmass, the second biggest on the face of the earth. We have a rather perverse climate that stretches all the way from the North Pole to the same latitude as the state of California. You have every culture, every religion, every color and creed, every political perspective on the face of the earth, all mixed together, not in a melting pot like the United States, but in a very distinctive mosaic. From coast to coast to coast, but mostly spread out in this very thin line right along the 49th parallel right up against the United States. You could hardly imagine a more difficult set of circumstances from which to try to forge a country. But we have forged one, and it has taken a lot of patience, a lot of give and take, a real willingness to try to see the best in other people. I think in our circumstances, the fact that we have such vast geography and a relatively small but complicated population, but spread out, provides us with some unique opportunities to get along well with each other. There will always be challenges. In a multicultural, diverse society, there will always be pressures to blow things apart. And you really have to work at this capacity to want to listen to each other, to reach out, to understand each other, to try to make room for one another, and to build a country together. We're certainly not held together by any kind of cultural homogeneity or language homogeneity. We have 2 official languages and dozens of others, including indigenous languages. What holds Canadians together is their common will, their adherence to a certain set of values. We are a country not because we have to be, but because we want to be. And that means every day doing your best to get along with each other. And that give and take, make room for each other. And I guess when Canadians look in the mirror, they say, well, if we can't do that here, who in the world could do it somewhere else? So there's almost an obligation on Canadians to make this work. It's not perfect. There are frictions, and there are arguments, and there are pressures. And you really have to have the political will to rise above that and to see that this accomplishment of Canada is something that we have an obligation to preserve, and it would be a horrible travesty if we let it go.
This audience here, of course, has lived through the ups and downs of the desire of a lot of people in Scotland to be an independent country. Mm-hmm. How would you compare the situation in Canada, the degree of separateness and the degree of glue, compared with what you've seen in Britain in the last 2.5 years? Do you think that your situation in Canada is rather more settled than you see here?
It may be, but you never take it for granted. That's, I think, the core message of Canadian unity. You have to work at it every day, and never get sanguine about it. Never think that, okay, that was an issue of 25 years ago, and we'll never have that problem again. Those pressures and forces that drive wedges amongst people and push them apart, those pressures will always be there. So always have unity and cohesion and fair play and fair treatment for the others in your society. The way to build bridges, to listen, to understand, to pull people together. You have to work at that every day. And if you ever let down your guard, those separation instincts will pop back to the surface again.
I'm going to take you to the Arctic next, because we've got several questions about that. And there's a sting in the tail of one of them, I think. Right, Ian Watson, does Canada see the opening of the Northwest Passage as an advantage to trade as global warming continues? John Potter. What does Canada think will be the political impact of the Arctic ice melting? And Christine Ratz puts it a different way. What is the present relationship with Russia regarding Russia's attempt at territorial gains in the Arctic? And one might say that they could be, one might even imagine that they'll become your collaborators up in that region. Would you like to talk about that?
Well, the Arctic is part of the definition of what is Canada. For the longest while, of course, because of climate and weather and the ice cover, it was a remote region that was inhabited by indigenous people, but rarely had any kind of external intrusion. Climate change is changing all of that. Sooner or later, the Northwest Passage will actually be navigable from one side to the other. And Canada is determined to exercise its sovereignty in the north. That, by the way, is one of the issues that we have to work out with our neighbors in the United States, who of course have Alaska, and our friends and allies elsewhere, like the United Kingdom, that have a very great interest in navigable waterways everywhere. And we welcome the international community into Canadian waterways with that very caveat. Those are Canadian waterways under the sovereign jurisdiction of Canada, and that needs to be recognized and defended. We will be making investments in the future in a whole variety of ways across the north to demonstrate that sovereignty in the scientific activity that goes on, for example, in the distribution of internet and other technology, information technology systems, to make sure all of that region is included and feels included in the rest of Canada, making sure that the indigenous people in the north share fully in all of the benefits that should be theirs as citizens of Canada, making sure that we have the appropriate defense capacities to protect the north. It's a great asset from Canada's point of view to face onto three oceans: Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic. But we have considerable work to do to show that dynamism moving north. One of the opportunities there is in the development of critical minerals and development to the advantage of indigenous people that might not otherwise have a source of livelihood, a viable economy. Mineral developments, including critical minerals, could be very crucial for indigenous people in the mid-north and in the high Arctic.
We've got quite a few questions, as you can imagine, about climate change. And I'm just going to start off with a batch here that may be against Canada's interest. Let's see what you have to say. Tony Fernyhoff, does Canada have any targets for reducing the sale of petrol and diesel cars? That's a minor question compared with what is the future for the tar sands in the context of reducing fossil fuels and the dependence of the Canadian economy on their continued exploitation. Ditto John Whitehead. Jonathan Donat, tar sand extraction has transformed the Canadian economy, but global climate change must affect the future of the industry. How will Canada manage? Any plans?
Well, very carefully, because those questions epitomize the challenge that Canada faces, because those resource extractions are exceedingly important, or have been historically, to the development of Canada. But Canada has very clearly recognized the obligation that we have to ourselves and to the rest of the world in terms of climate change. We have been very proactive participants in all of the COPs since, well, pretty well from the very beginning. There was a hiatus between between 2006 to 2015. But Mr. Trudeau, as the current Prime Minister, has made it very clear that climate change is an abiding priority for his government, and that will include the development of Canada's very considerable renewable energy resources, whether that is wind or solar or hydrogen or hydro in some cases, as well as utilizing the technologies of carbon capture and utilization. We at the High Commission have been promoting some very strong partnerships between Canadian projects and British investors in developing the green economy of the future that we have to make as economically successful as the old economy that we've been used to. We have done things in a certain way for a very long time, and as we go through this energy transformation, it will mean finding new and better ways to do it greener. And Canada has been well endowed in hydrocarbons, but we are equally well endowed in the green economy. The capacity for green hydrogen, for example, from Canada is simply enormous. The ability to develop wind power and solar power, we're just beginning to scratch the surface, but the potential there is huge. The challenge is the pace at which all of this has to move, and making sure that you're successfully bringing along with you the people who would see themselves as victims rather than as winners from the transformation. Okay. That's the political challenge, and it's not easy.
Just a very quick question, but because you had a bit of a beef about beef. And we don't want to spend too much time on it because Alison says, given that scientists all state that we should eat less meat, what is Canada doing to prepare its farmers to produce alternative products? And we've got Steve here. Would you know, would you believe it? Looking out here, we've got a British beef producer in the audience. And he wonders why Canadian beef isn't good enough standard to be imported into Britain. Now, we haven't got time for you to have a technical discussion with him, but you might want to have one sentence to explain to Steve about that. And you might have another sentence for Alison to say whether the idea of eating differently is permeating Canada as we are being lectured about it in this intensively cultivated country.
On the issue of beef, the Canadian beef in terms of health standards and quality is absolutely good enough to get into the British market as well as the European market. The issue is non-tariff trade barriers that are standing in the way, and that's what has to be eventually either negotiated or litigated, and we'll see how that process turns out. It will be up to, if it comes to a litigation, it'll be up to both sides to make their best cases in front of impartial tribunals, and we'll see what they rule. And those tribunals are typically selected by both sides to make sure that they are both informed and qualified to make those judgments. In the case of diets for people moving forward, that's actually going to be driven by consumers more than anything else. And there is a growing demand in the world. You see it in Canada, you see it in North America more generally, you see it in Europe, you see it in Asia, a demand for protein sources beyond beef, not to the exclusion of beef, but as an alternative. Give people the choice. And I'm very pleased to say that there is a new development in Canada called the Canadian Protein Supercluster that is developing across the prairies, producing all of these brand new food ingredients based on protein that come from plants. It's estimated that the market for those products around the world will total $7 billion within the next 15 to 20 years. $7 billion worth of market potential. And that's just at the estimate now. It's growing every day. So consumers will decide what they want in their diets. As much meat as before, or plant sources for the future. From Canada's point of view, we want to be the preeminent producers of both meat protein and plant protein. The plant protein has a ways to go to catch up because they have huge potential in lentils and peas and beans and so forth. But it's a new industry in Canada, but it's growing very rapidly. The world's largest producer of lentils is from my hometown of Regina, Saskatchewan. Murad Al-Khatib is his name. He runs AGT Foods, and he grows those products across the prairies in Canada and sells them around the world. And Canada wants to be
the lentil capital of Canada.
The lentil capital of Canada,
right.
yes.
Good.
And chickpeas.
I've got loads of questions here, but if anyone wants a microphone, please put up your hand and let our team see that you want it. I'm going to move on now. This question could take all night, so we need a quick answer, and you can't give us one. But it's from John. He wonders whether the UK-Canada trade deal will be different from the EU-Canada trade deal. Is that something you can sum up in the space of a couple of sentences?
It will. We want the deal with the UK to build on the deal with the EU. The EU deal was negotiated almost 10 years ago. Then, just to give you one example, digital was not a big deal. It didn't figure in the negotiations at all 10 years ago when we negotiated the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement with the EU that then included the UK. But now that we're negotiating ab initio, the standalone deal with the UK, there's a real focus on digital because we've learned from the result of the pandemic that this is a big and important part of the British economy and the Canadian economy, and we can make it a productive partnership for both of us. So we established the rules for how you protect intellectual property and so forth, but without creating trade barriers that diminish the trade. So the short answer is we are trying to build on the EU deal to make the deal with the UK that much better for both of us.
Can we talk quickly about the Commonwealth and another related aspect? Do you still feel that the Commonwealth can cooperate? I mean, Harry's noting the tensions with India and the struggle to find destinations for Commonwealth Games, including the withdrawal of Canada in that arena. And I'm going to couple that with Roy Price's question, because he's saying, because of our good relationship with Canada, can you ever see Canada becoming a republic? He wants you to know that 4 of his distant relatives emigrated there in the 1920s, so he's not got an axe to grind. But it comes up if we talk to, if anyone from Australia is here, it's an issue. Yeah. We know where your sympathies lie, but what's your sense of where the Commonwealth has got to go?
The Commonwealth, we think really it's an amazing family of countries, and a lot of credit goes to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth for nurturing it through all of its post-war reinvention. But it's 56 countries, 2.5 billion people. That's a third of the world's population on every continent except Antarctica. It's a unique collection of north and south, east and west, rich and poor, big and small. You'd never find that collection of countries anywhere else. And if you set out to invent the Commonwealth today, you couldn't do it. It's a fluke of history, and largely a fluke of British history that had the universal connection with most of these countries. It has to do, I think, a better job of its own internal administration. So it's a model of transparency and accountability and good governance. So some of the standards within the Commonwealth have to be enhanced, I think. It also has to do a better job of prioritization, because when you get those 56 countries together, they all want to do everything. And that tends to mean that what they do gets diluted because they're spread too far and too thin. It needs to focus on 2 or 3 critical priorities for what it does really well. Leadership on climate may be one of those. Good governance may be one of those. Education may be one of those, especially distance education for girls and young women. But focus is what the Commonwealth has to do. Focus on what it is really good at and really succeed at that. But it's a tremendous organization, and I must say, on the relationship with India, the Indian High Commissioner in London and I have become acquainted with each other over the last year or so when we've both been there at the same time. He is a wonderful public servant, and I look forward to working with him very constructively on a whole range of issues where we have a lot of common interest and want to succeed together. The issue around the monarchy, those two, the Commonwealth and the monarchy, ought to be kept just a little bit separate, because all of those countries that say they would want to have a different constitutional structure rather than having the monarchy as the monarch as the head of state, they invariably say, but that does not mean we want to leave the Commonwealth. In fact, in the Commonwealth today, of those 56 countries, only 15 of us are monarchies. The others are all republics already. So there's a distinction between the future of the monarchy and the future of the Commonwealth. However, the monarch is the head of the Commonwealth, so there's a link. But for the debate in Canada, we have gone through 70 years where there was one marvelous personality in the role of the monarch, for whom there was enormous love and respect. And now, after 7 decades, she is gone. And it's only natural, I think, with that magnitude of change, that some people will ask some questions. What about this? What about that? Should we change? And so forth. That kind of introspection, I think, is only natural. In some countries, it might go further than in others. In Canada, the debate may take place I can't predict that for sure, but it may. But I think at the end of the day, Canadians will opt for the democratic constitutional monarchy that we have in place at the present time. There's sort of a very practical political rule: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. There's some basic political realities in Canada. This kind of a change would take a constitutional amendment that would require unanimous consent within the Canadian Federation. So the Senate, the House of Commons, and all 10 of the provinces. I don't know how well acquainted you are with Canadian constitutional proceedings, but unanimous consent is a pretty rare bird. I can't think of an example where we actually achieved it. As well, you can't say in a constitutional debate, well, we'll just open the Constitution a little bit, and we'll change this one little thing down here, this monarchy thing. We'll change that. Once you've opened the Constitution, you've opened the Constitution. And every province will have their list of issues that they want put into the constitutional debate. So it's not a process that Canadians would likely get into, given all of the other issues that we've got to deal with. Plus, at the same time, King Charles is focused on several things that really matter to Canadians, not the least of which is his desire to have a positive impact on the healing and the reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Canadians. And if he's able to have that impact, it will be an enormous gift to Canada.
Thank you. Now we've got a question, front row, centre in front of us.
Your Excellency, you've covered a number of times climate change and the repercussions thereof. Last week, there was a lot of that because the subject was world migration patterns. And Guy Vince, the Speaker, indicated that Canada was trying to triple its population via immigration, she said. I just wonder what, in general, whether that's true, in fact, and whether Canada has the similar problems to other countries regarding immigration of all sorts and migration.
Well, we do. Migration and immigration are always contentious issues, but by and large, the vast majority of Canadians historically have viewed immigration as a positive thing. After all, every Canadian, unless you are fully Indigenous, every Canadian is an immigrant from somewhere. So immigration has been a fundamental part of Canada's existence from the very beginning. And the statistics show that immigration adds to our GDP, contributes to growth, creates jobs, builds the economy. What we need to make sure of is, as the pace of immigration over time grows, that our capacity to service the needs of a growing population keep pace in terms of housing and health services and education and so forth. It's a rather hollow bargain if you invite people to come to your country and then they're not able to live fulfilling lives. So we are focused on increasing the numbers, but there was an announcement made by the Minister of Immigration just within the last week that the targets going forward, which run in the neighborhood of, they have been running at about 300,000 a year, more recently 400,000 a year. They were targeted to continue to go to 500,000 a year and then keep moving up. The Minister of Immigration has signaled that those numbers will be set taking into account the capacity of the country to deal with issues like housing. And housing is a universal challenge around the world. We've got that problem. The UK's got the problem. The US has the problem. The capacity to get affordable housing into the system and onto the market that give people the prospect of always having a decent roof over their heads that they can afford. And that's something that every government is wrestling with now worldwide.
All these are questions about immigration into Canada. We can't possibly put them all, but there's a couple of them actually I thought quite interesting because, as you are well aware, Britain has got a bit of a problem, and our Prime Minister currently has a bit of a problem because of a decision that was announced yesterday. Mm-hmm. So I think someone's putting two together and getting 5, and they're wondering whether Canada could help Rishi Sunak out of his difficulties to buy. I mean, Canada would be a much better place than Rwanda. So the idea that they seem to be coming up with, possibly prompted by your talk, you could solve the problem for us.
I will put that on the agenda for the next bilateral. And I'm sure neither Prime Minister will thank me for it. So.
And just to show, they seem to have a sense of humour out there because Andrew Creswell mentions Margaret Atwood's, a famous Canadian novel, The Handmaid's Tale, mm-hmm. in which American citizens sought sanctuary in Canada, apparently. If Trump wins the next U.S. election, do you think many U.S. citizens will wish to move to Canada, and would Canada welcome them as well?
We saw a bit of that 3 or 4 years ago. There was a number of Americans that were at least talking about it. I don't know whether they ever got to doing it or not. We have an incredibly important relationship with the United States, and we have gone through a long succession of Canadian governments and American governments. Some of them liked each other and some of them didn't. Some of them more colorful than others. But Canada has developed a knack of getting along with our big American neighbor. And whatever political stripe might at any moment occupy the White House. And one of the clear indications of that was in the last administration when Mr. Trump was president. He spoke very aggressively about canceling the NAFTA trade agreement between Canada and the U.S. or renegotiating it, and there was a negotiation, and the result was very favorable from Canada's point of view. There was an excellent negotiating team led by the Prime Minister and by then our Trade Minister, Chrystia Freeland, who is now the Minister of Finance. But the Canadians just put their nose to the grindstone and were determined to deal with this situation in a constructive way and get a good result for Canada. And we did. It takes a lot of patience and a lot of careful negotiating, but you get to the fundamental bottom line, and that is pointing out to companies and cities and states and counties and senators and members of the House of Representatives and ultimately to the White House the fundamental importance of that relationship with Canada. I had the task of explaining some of that in the state of Kentucky as a minister of the cabinet that time. And it was very interesting, pointing out to local decision makers and chambers of commerce and government representatives how many jobs in this community depend on a trading relationship with Canada. and you just add them up. The number of companies, the number of jobs that are created, the amount of economic well-being in the United States that depends on that close relationship with Canada and the supply lines. I'm talking in the state of Michigan, you explain, the average car that's produced in North America, and we have a cross-border relationship in building automobiles. The average car in North America, while it's being manufactured, with all the parts that go into it that come from different places all over the continent, some of them in Canada, some of them in the United States, that car crosses the border 7 times while it's being built. That's how tight this relationship is between Canada and the United States. That's how those supply lines work back and forth across the 49th parallel. Every day, there are 400,000 people who cross back and forth between Canada and the United States. Every day, 400,000. And there's $2.5 billion in trade that goes back and forth across that border with the United States. And then you maybe get into a few of the more emotional issues, like what about those folks in Gander that received thousands of American travelers who couldn't land in New York City when the towers blew up? Who was the commander of NORAD on the day of 9/11? It was a Canadian. You just go through all of the intricate details of this relationship that has existed officially since 1867, but I suppose it started when we burned the White House in 1812. But it's a profound relationship. You can't take it for granted. And you have to sit down with all of those legislators on the American side and go through that chapter and verse. Once you've had the opportunity to explain the vitality and the depth and the strength of that relationship, neither side wants to mess it up.
Well, we're going to finish on a note of geopolitics, because I don't want to miss the question from one of our students, Zena. And it's about Canada's place in the world in the future, I suppose. You mentioned that the era of American hegemony has started to decline. So she wonders whether you think that Canada can, in some way, replace America's role as a true global superpower. How ambitious are you? And Glenn Warren wonders whether you'll step up to the plate, because with the US withdrawing more, he wonders whether Canada will up its defense spending. He says it's currently 1.32%. He wonders whether it can be 2% or more. So will Canada be a bigger power in the future than it has been?
We're a middle power in the world. We focus a lot in our foreign affairs upon humanitarian issues and concerns, but we're also there when the tough stuff has to be done, and I think in many ways we've demonstrated that in our support with respect to Ukraine. A lot has gone into humanitarian aid and receiving the refugees and so forth. But we've also invested in the hardware, the automated anti-aircraft systems, the tanks that Canada has sent, the heavy artillery and so forth. We're increasing on all of those fronts. But I think the fundamental contribution that Canada can make is in reliability. It goes back to that issue of respect and trust as between Canada and the UK, or Canada and any other ally. When these things have been tested in the past, Afghanistan's an illustration. Ukraine's another. The Canadian contribution has always punched above its weight. And Canadians, I think, will want to continue to do that in the world. But we'll work very hard to achieve a peaceful world that is fair and inclusive for everybody.
What I'd like to do is not to put this question to you, but I'd like to read it out, because you have impressed Amanda Snape, and she wonders what would be your aspiration in the future, considering, when you give up your current role as High Commissioner. My thought is if you stick around in London long enough, there could well be a Prime Ministership available, because tonight you have demonstrated great diplomatic skill, great political skill in presenting to us your vision of Canada. And I think, as you've noticed from all the questions that have come your way, you've made it a fascinating evening for everyone at Keele World Affairs, and we're so grateful for your presence here. Thank you, High Commissioner.
Thank
Ralph
you.
Goodale.
Very kind. Thank you very much.